Now we'll have our plenary session. We'll have three presentations. First, the presenter is Niklas Elmqvist. He is a professor in the iSchool, and he is also the director of this HCIL lab and a member of the UMIX. So with that, Niklas, please start your presentation.
Thank you. So now I'm here in a different hat as a researcher and not the director of the HCIL. So yes, I'm a professor here since 2014. And my research outside of managing the HCIL is data visualization. That means I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to create pictures that represent data to help people understand that data. But today, this morning, I'm actually going to talk about something different, where we're trying to find ways to represent data for people who cannot actually see pictures, for people who are blind or visually impaired. But let me start by defining visualization. So visualization is this idea that we create interactive pictures of information in a way that allows us to more easily understand those pictures. So this is Confucius, of course, and one of the sayings attributed to him is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Of course, this turns out not to be true. It was actually a journalist in the early 1900s who wanted to coin this phrase, and to gain some traction, he decided to attribute it to Confucius, but it actually was just some random guy who came up with the term. But I think we all agree with the general sentiment that there are many ways we can represent information that in a visual form that is hard to do in other forms. And one example of these, there are plenty of examples of visualization throughout the ages, but in this case, we have John Snow, who was one of the first epidemiologists, which is very relevant today, of course. He lived in 1800s England, and in 1854, he was asked to track down and stop an outbreak of cholera in the Soho district of London. Now, he was trying to figure out this information by reading lists upon lists of victims who had fallen ill to this sickness. And at the time, medical science wasn't really aware of bacteria, but he had the notion that the bacteria was waterborne and was carried through the pump systems throughout the area. The problem was, of course, he couldn't figure out where. So he had the notion of eventually plotting these cases on a map. So in this picture here, you see the Soho district of London, where each case of cholera was marked with a black bar. And if you squint your eyes and look real hard, you're going to see that there's one area on this map that stands out. An area of the map close to the Broad Street pump. And you see that pump almost in the center. So that picture told John Snow that that might actually be the pump that was carrying disease. He walked down to that pump, he put a lock on it. The pump is still there, the lock is still there if you go there in real world or today's London. And sure enough, the cholera outbreak subsided. So that's one example of the power of data visualizations. And there are many examples like this one. But today, of course, visualization has progressed into interactive pictures that are shown on computers. And I'm not going to talk about all of these examples, but I'm sure you've seen some of these in the past. We see some representations that show data over time, some that show data over space, some that show hierarchies. And on the upper right corner, you see a tree map, which is actually invented by Ben Schneiderman and collaborators here at the University of Maryland. And of course, the utility of data visualization in today's society, where we have such an explosion of data that's available to everyone, is becoming increasingly important. But there's a bit of an elephant in the room. I've been using the terms visual and visualization and vision many times. But what happens if you have low vision or are actually blind. If you're blind, are you forever locked away from all this wonderful mechanism of visualizing data to understand society better? And because society is increasingly relying on data when you're making decisions, from paying your bills and balancing your checkbook to deciding what products to buy, where to go on vacation, where to send your children to school, and even who to vote for. Does that mean that you don't have access to all this information? And how can you make the correct decisions if you are not? And will you be disadvantaged compared to people who are able to use these mechanisms? And this is also not a small population of people. It depends on who you ask, but there's something like 300 million individuals that have visual impairments in the world, and 40 million of them are totally blind. And here in the US, there's somewhere between 7 to 15 million people who are either low vision or are blind. So think about that. That's millions of people who are potentially locked away from modern mechanisms of understanding our increasingly more complex world. It's also worth noting that vision can be a fleeting thing, because many people, when they get older, experience decreased vision. So if we can help people who are blind, we can also help many of ourselves as we grow older. And this is generally called the curb cut effect, if you've heard a little bit about accessibility, because adding curb cuts to sidewalks will obviously help people in wheelchairs, but it will also help people who are situationally impaired. So someone who's walking with a stroller will have a hard time getting their stroller up on the sidewalk, but a curb cut will help them. Or someone who's perhaps lugging a big suitcase or is busy with something else. So at the same time, it's also interesting that speaking to blind individuals, this is also a very interested population who wants to take advantage of data. And if you ask them, it's surprising how many of blind individuals will tell you that they are visual people. This may seem a bit like a paradox, but if you think about it, we're all spatial beings that move around in a physical world. So understanding space and relationships is obviously not something that's unique to people with vision. So we should find ways in the research community of data visualization to make access to all this information more universal. But many of my colleagues and myself in the past included have tended to overlook this population, mostly looking at perhaps people with color blindness, but not addressing the bigger picture. How do we ensure equal access of increasing amounts of data to everyone? In my research group, we've been looking at this for a few years now, and I am here to talk about some of these projects. A lot of this started here at Maryland a couple of years ago when we had a blind student who enrolled in my data visualization class that one of my PhD students was teaching. He was the instructor of. And this put us at a little bit of a difficult situation, because we had a hard time at the time to figure out ways how a person who is blind can not just read visualizations, but in this class you have to learn how to design them and think about them and design new ways to convey data. But my student, Eric Newberger, who's instructor for this class, had an interesting insight. So he created these magnet boards, so basically just metal boards with magnets that are either attached to lollipop sticks or just on their own, that we can use to, with an assistant, can organize in a shape that conveys what's being shown on the screen. So this is a brilliant but very low-tech solution to a difficult problem. And it shows the way of how we could potentially use not necessarily advanced technology to replicate the visual elements that we're accustomed to using on the screen as data visualization researchers. And it's an example of, in this case, using touch. instead of vision. So in the case here, the student could just run their hand over the shapes that were formed and get a feeling for the data that was being represented. So that's in general an example of what's called sensory substitution, which is common where instead it's common in accessibility work where you have a sense that is impaired or not functioning, and you replace that sense with another one. In this case, we replace vision with touch. So those themes we'll see throughout this talk. Common one is to use touch. That's one of the more common ones, and we'll see examples of this too. But we can also use sound, another common sensory substitution, or even smell. And I'll talk about that soon. That sounds intriguing, I know. So, but let's start with hearing and sound, and looking at ways how we can use the replace vision with sound to convey data. Now, data visualization is everywhere, and I've already touched upon this already, but if you look online and you read articles, you'll often come across data visualizations that are just represented using pixels. They are pixels of charts, of bar charts, of line charts, of pie charts, or whatever, and that's really difficult because in general, a blind person accessing the web will use a screen reader, which just converts the written word on the screen with verbal words that you can listen to. But as soon as it encounters an image that contains a chart, then a screen reader will not be able to work with that very effectively because it's hard to caption, it's hard to represent that data. What you really want is to extract the data that was encoded in the visualization, but you can't easily do that by just looking at the pixels. So some of my collaborators and I had this idea that perhaps we could use machine learning to create mechanical eyes that looked at these visualizations and extracted the data from them and then presented it to the user in a way where they could access it using screen readers. So in this project, we came up with a pipeline, a machine learning pipeline, or computer vision pipeline that started by an input image on the one hand. In this case, it's a bar chart. And as a first step, it would classify that image into a visualization type. Is it a line chart, a bar chart, a pie chart? Depending on the visualization type, it would then do different things, of course, because different visualizations have different encodings. That's what makes this challenging. In this case, he would first extract the labels on the vertical and horizontal axes to figure out the scales and the labels for the data. And then in the next stage, it would detect the objects, in this case, the actual bars, and then finally extract those bars by figuring out how big the bars are in comparison to the scale. So in the end, you end up with a table that represents the data, which is, of course, not ideal. In a perfect world, we would also find an alternative representation of that data that would make understanding the data efficient, but at least we have been able to recover the data that was locked away in pixels, and we can then present that to a person with a screen reader. We ended up creating a Chrome extension that would automatically detect these images and then replace them with a data table. So in essence, the blind person reading that article would never notice that there was a bar chart being visualized. They would just find the data. They would just find the data and could browse it as needed. All right, I know I said smell, so let's talk about that. How can we use smell to convey data? Well, a couple of years ago, one of the master students in HCI approached me about using smell or olfaction in this manner. And he is now a PhD student. His name is Biswaksan Patnaik, and he's built a bunch of these so-called olfactory displays. You see them here. In the foreground is the control tower. In the background on the table is the actually olfaction unit, and then there's a monitor. The way we are doing this work, of course, is as a complement to visualization, a way for someone to get additional sensory information to better understand what's going on. But in general, olfaction, the use of smell, just like just like a screen is used to show pixels to convey data, an olfactory display uses smells. Olfaction can be used for situations not just as a complement, but also in situations where a person either can't look because maybe they're situationally impaired, they're driving or they're walking and they can't afford to look at a screen, or when they can't see. So that would be a person who is blind or visually impaired. So the way this unit works, in the background on the table, there are 24 bottles containing essential oils, and each of the caps has an atomic diffuser, as a diffuser, ultrasonic diffuser, I should say, that we can control to diffuse, a little like you would have in a humidifier at home. By turning on and off these diffusers, we can generate smells, and these 3 fans you might see on the unit will then send those smells and blend them and send them to the person sitting in front of the display. This video here shows another one of my collaborators. This is Andrea Bach, who's using a mobile version of this olfactory display. It's hanging around her head-mounted display, and as you can see, it's emanating these essential oils by when the diffusers are turned on. And then she was exploring a 3D visualization. So depending on what she was seeing, different data would show different smells and be blended in different ways. It's important here to note that we are not trying to create immersive gaming environments or realistic environments, simulation environments. Instead, we're trying, this is, by the way, this is the tabletop version, an earlier version of the big one you saw earlier. Instead, we're trying to use smells to convey data. So we're not trying to add realism to someone, let's say, exploring a cave or running in a rainforest. Instead, we're using smells like lemon, for example, to convey, let's say, the stock price of Microsoft, or we could use amounts of lavender to show information over time and so on. So it's a way to generalize the use of smell beyond just realism and realistic environments. All right, so the last theme I'll talk about for how to substitute vision for another sense is touch. And of course, the most common one people think of when they think of touch for blind individuals is the Braille alphabet, where we have these normally six arrangements of 2x3 grids of dots, and we raise the dots to convey various characters. So this would be the Braille alphabet. And on a computer system, we typically have so-called refreshable Braille displays. You see that here. You see a long row of white dots. These dots can be interactively pushed up or pushed down to recreate an entire line of text. And reading it just means running your hand over this display line. Now we have an idea on how potentially use this for conveying data, where we could essentially hijack a Braille display to convey information of data distribution and bar charts. So to give you an example, here would be an example of a bar chart that shows a data distribution. This is almost a bell curve shape, which might be perhaps the different grade GPAs of a bunch of students, or perhaps different heights, or some other normally distributed data set. Now, if we wanted to convey this using a refreshable Braille display, what we could do is to say, let's assign one key on this display per bar. So we'll have a corresponding set of bars underneath, and then we'll raise the number of dots depending on how filled the corresponding bar is. So that would end up looking something like this. So you see here on the far left, there's the bar is very small, so we'll have no dots raised. Same thing on the other side, on the far right side. And in the middle, we have a bar that's almost full. It almost goes to 100%. That Braille, we would raise all of the dots. So now by just running your fingers across the Braille characters, we could get a feeling for the shape of this data distribution. So I am now able to remove the visual representation and just keep the Braille characters. And in essence, I can now replicate the data distribution where I can feel it instead of seeing it. We're also doing work on so-called mid-air haptics. This is ultra haptic display, which uses ultrasound to generate sensations of touch in mid-air above the device. So we are currently embarking on a research project with some researchers at the University of Sussex, where we're trying to figure out how can we create spatial, volumetric representations of data that you can feel in mid-air instead of on, for example, a surface or a Braille display. So that would allow, this is just a demo from showing how this might work, but you see the the mid-air haptic device here creates, of course, there's no vision. This is just added for effect here, but when you put your hand over it, you can feel that virtual shape, and you can move it. The final project I'll talk about before I close for questions is more ongoing work on using touch. This is what we call VisBot. It's a triangular robot that has 3 wheels. As you can see, it has a little handle and it has an engine. And the way it works is you can put down this on a surface and it will start moving. And it's a pretty strong engine. So the notion here is you could connect this to a particular data shape. So let's say the stock market value of Microsoft or Facebook or Google, or the temperature readings from a particular weather station over time. And then you would have this device, putting it on a flat surface, it would start following that shape. So all you have to do is to put your hand on the handle and let your hand be guided by this device. Or alternatively, you could grab the device and you could move it on your own, and you'd feel varying amounts of force feedback in your hand depending on the data that you're exploring. So we're thinking this might be another opportunity to use touch to convey data to someone who is not able to see. So let me close by just summarizing the theme that has, I think, threaded throughout this presentation, which is about how do we ensure equal access of all this data to everyone, where we find ways to replace vision with other senses. And it allows us as data visualization researchers to go beyond the original definition of just using pixels, but also using other ways to help people in a universal way access data. I want to close by thanking the students and collaborators that have made all of this possible, and of course the sponsors and funding agencies. And I'm happy to take any questions that you would have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niklas. So now we're open for questions. If you have any question, please use the chat option below.
Or you can use the Q&A the option. It should be a QA option.
For some reasons, the attendees weren't able to see the Q&A.
Okay.
But if you can, please use that. But if not, please use the chat option. So Niklas, we have our first question. So which journal are you going to publish it?
So there's a bunch of different projects in this work. Some of them published and some ongoing and some even just ambitious plans for future work. So I think it depends. A lot of what we've been doing has been to try to help other colleagues in data visualization recognize that this is an interesting research area with lots of compelling questions. So really getting our colleagues to acknowledge this elephant in the room. So a lot of the work that we've done so far has gone to data visualization and HCI places. So some of the olfaction work has been published at the IEEE InfoVis conference and also at the CHI conference. But I'm myself just learning about the research fields of accessibility. So I've been working with some of my colleagues in the HCIL, including Jonathan Lazar, in navigating the right places to publish this kind of work. So I'm open to those things in the future.
Great. Another question is, how do you deal with smells that linger for a while?
That's a good point. Olfaction is difficult, and ideally we would have Andrea Batch, the student who will be presenting. She'll be in a Q&A session later this morning. She can answer the details. But the way we've designed the olfactory display so that it has fans that you can control. So that will improve the refresh rate, so we can hopefully push smells away so they don't linger for too long. When we run studies like this, you sometimes need ways to neutralize, to go between one smell to another one. So you need neutral smells. But it is one of those particular challenges of using olfactory displays. What's that? Sorry.
Okay. Given the time that we have, I'll pick the last question. So what's the bit rate of the olfactory device, and what kind of bandwidth might be possible? It's
a good question. So in the work we just published at CHI, we studied the unique capabilities of smell and different aspects of smell, which includes the type of smell, lemon versus lavender versus oil versus coffee, as well as the amount of smell, increasing amounts of lemon or something like that. And even we even thought about ways, how can we smell? And it turns out that smell is actually directional. You can smell from left and right, so it's stereo. And in that session, you can get some more details on which of these different parameters are strong. It turns out that amount of smell is very individual. Some people are better at sensing different levels of smell than others. So the most robust way to convey smell is to use different types of smell. So using coffee compared to lemon. And in fact, there are ways you can pick smells that come from different smell groups. There are certain groups of smells that are related. And if you want people to actually be able to recognize and separate two different smells, you want to pick smells from different smell groups to make that possible. But we haven't done a formal analysis of sort of the information entropy in information olfactation. That might be an interesting project for the future.